I woke up to the sounds of cans being shuffled and tossed outside my bedroom window. It was loud and irritating, and I covered my head with the pillow to shut out the noise. It didn't help. "Is he back again?" my wife asked from beside me. "What time is it?" I looked at the numbers on my phone, sitting on the table beside the bed. Not even 6 o'clock. "Can you please get rid of him?" As much as I didn't want to get out of the warm bed to venture out into the chilly morning air, I wouldn't be able to sleep if he stayed out there. And if memory was serving me correctly, he was going to be out there for quite a while. Mr. Scraps was a connoisseur of cans, and he was very discriminating. With an annoyed grunt and a few words muttered beneath my breath, I got out of bed and put on my slippers. Mr. Scraps. The scourge of our pleasant little middle-income neighborhood. No one knew where the man had come from. He seemed to just appear one day. At first I thought he would be there for a few days and the cops would make him move it along to the next little town or to another neighborhood. But instead he stuck around. Once or twice I saw the cops questioning him, but they'd always get back into their car afterwards and drive off. When people spoke to him, they weren't quite the same afterwards either. At least, it seemed that way to me. The cops in our town were acting funny now, since they'd encountered Mr. Scraps one by one. Each time they'd approached him with a determined look in their eye, according to reports, and then they'd wander off slightly confused and disoriented. When they drove away in their cars, the police officers seemed to have forgotten how to drive, although they usually picked it up again, quickly enough, after a few minutes. I served on city council, and word was starting to spread about these little incidents. It was hard to explain, but Mr. Scraps had an effect on people. At least that was the rumor. I told myself it was silly, though. Like people who claim to have been hypnotized on stage by performers. Those things weren't really possible. You couldn't fundamentally change based on one encounter with a stranger. When I was half asleep in my bed, I'd partially forgotten about all of these encounters. But now that I was on my way to talk to Mr. Scraps for myself, I had to admit I was getting a bit nervous. I remembered my neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, and how she had gone out to scold him for rummaging through her cans. I'd been watching from my front window after hearing the loud noises he'd been making. Through the window pane, their conversation was muted, but I could still observe, with a quiet raptness, the strange sight that was happening across the street. Mrs. Donnelly in her housecoat, tromping down the driveway and looking angry, her pink fuzzy slippers and robe in stark contrast to the furious expression on her face. When she got to the end of the driveway, though, her face changed. Mr. Scraps said barely a word to her, and yet she turned around and started stumbling back up towards her house as if drunk. Meanwhile, the man continued rummaging through her cans, as if the interaction had barely distracted him for a second. I saw her the next day and spoke to her, and she barely said a word back to me. Her usually well-kept hair was disheveled, and for once I saw she was wearing no makeup at all. Typically, the woman was a picture of elegance and style. I hardly ever saw her out of the house without a new article of clothing or jewelry, carrying her little designer dog in one hand. But that morning she was in the same pink housecoat and fuzzy slippers as the day before. Her clothes were dirty, as if she'd been outside all night in the forest, or rolling around on the grass. She'd been smiling, too, looking very happy, whereas usually she was a bit sour and complained a lot. We don't talk much, so I just said good morning to her and asked if she was alright. I'd been out fetching the paper from the end of the driveway, but she looked like she was just wandering her property aimlessly. She mumbled something back and stumbled away, seemingly with no intention of going back inside. "Mrs. Donnelly, are you alright?" I called after her again, but received no response. The more I thought about these strange events, the more nervous I became, going outside to confront Mr. Scraps. It seemed like I should be more scared, as if the whole town, should be more scared of this man who had arrived out of nowhere. But instead, we were treating him just like another vagrant. I paused at the front door, wondering to myself if I should really go outside. What would happen to me if I did? Was he really just some poor man without a home, looking through bins for empty bottles? Or was Mr. Scrap something much worse? Something much darker and more mysterious? I shook off that idea as lunacy. Things like that didn't really exist outside of horror movies and podcasts. This was real life. Mr. Scraps wasn't some sorcerer. He was just a man without a home looking to make some measly income somehow. Turning the doorknob, I stepped outside into the chilly early morning air. The grass was covered in dew and the sky was still dark. I could still hear the sounds of Mr. Scraps going through the bins, tossing cans and bottles into his shopping cart, which he pushed all around town. He was really making a ruckus out there. It was almost like he wanted me to catch him. I walked over to him, feeling like my footsteps were very loud in the early morning air, so quiet that you could hear a train in the distance rattling along the tracks several miles away. The birds weren't out yet, and even the crickets seemed to have fallen silent, as if in anticipation. Suddenly, I was too terrified to speak to the man. Looking at him standing there, I began to wonder if he really was a man at all, or something else much different, much darker, something more powerful than a person. He began to turn around very slowly, and it was too much for me to bear. I ran back inside, trying to ignore the sounds of him snickering behind me. "Did you tell him to go away?" my wife asked as I came back into the bedroom. "'Cause he's still out there. Louder than ever." "I'll call the cops," I said. "He could be dangerous. You don't want to sneak up on somebody like that. You've heard the stories." My wife shot out of bed, looking angry. "Those cops don't do anything. He's been here for weeks and he's not going away. I'm sick of it. Those stories are a bunch of bullshit anyways." She stomped past me and I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. I yelled at her not to go out there, but she told me I was being ridiculous. I followed her to the front door and then stopped. Despite my fear for her, my own terror was now overriding that. I was beginning to feel more and more like this whole town had been lulled to sleep by this man, as if we were the proverbial toad in a pot of water being gradually brought up to a boil, our lives in terrible danger as we closed our eyes and told ourselves this man was just a regular person down on his luck. "Christine, wait!" I tried one more time, but she shot me the middle finger over her shoulder and continued stomping over towards the man who was now waking up the whole neighborhood with his noisy behavior. Lights were coming on in various houses as people looked outside to see what the commotion was all about. Again, I had that same thought. It's like he's doing it on purpose. Christine said something to the man, and he turned around to look at her, glancing over her shoulder at me momentarily as he did so. I saw his lips were moving, but his eyes were watching me. My wife turned around almost as soon as she'd arrived there, and after spinning on her heel, she walked past me and went right inside the house. "What did he say, Christine?" I asked as she went by. But she just ignored me. My wife, of the past 10 years, went by without saying a word and walked into the house immediately into the basement. I followed after her, hearing the sounds of tossed cans receding further and further into the distance as I went down the stairs into the darkness. Christine didn't even bother turning on a light. It was like she was on a mission. She went over to a pile of boxes and began lifting them up to get something at the bottom of the stack. What are you doing? I asked, feeling scared, watching my wife acting like a zombie. I went around in front of her and tried to pull her away from the boxes, but she was relentless. Couldn't be dissuaded. Finally, she found out what she was looking for and pulled it out. It was unmarked, and there was no indication of what it could be, but she seemed to know exactly what it was. As she removed the contents of the box and began to interact with what was inside, I started to back away, terrified. What the hell was happening to her? Why was she acting like this? I ran upstairs and went outside to scream at Mr. Scraps to ask him what he'd done to her, but he was gone. The next morning, Christine was still playing with the things from inside the box. I had stayed up all night watching her, trying to talk to her, but she didn't engage. She just kept playing with her old childhood doll, the one she had stowed away in a box all those years ago. I remembered her telling me once it had been her favorite, and the way she played with it, you could see the childlike wonder she had once possessed. She acted as if the toy were real, talking to it, and interacting with it as if it were her best friend, and she ignored me completely. I managed to get her outside to the car and take her to the hospital. Whatever Mr. Scraps had said to her had apparently caused some sort of mental break. I just hoped it was repairable. At first, my wife didn't want to get back in the car, but eventually I tried the tactic of telling her we were going out for ice cream, and she giggled and got into the back seat, not even trying to sit up front. She sat in the back and played with her doll as I drove us towards the hospital. I watched her nervously in the mirror, thinking how creepy it was to see a grown woman acting like a little kid again. There was nothing cute or endearing about it, and I was getting more and more worried about whether we'd be able to get her back to normal. I slammed hard on the brakes at a green light as two cop cars raced through a red, going perpendicular through the intersection just as we were about to pass through. The cop car up front had its siren and flashing lights off, but there was a police officer driving and looking out the window, laughing and looking back at the other cop behind him. The cop behind him was leaning out his window and firing his service revolver, trying to hit the other police car's tires. The sound of gunfire echoed through the neighborhood, and a stray bullet ricocheted and shattered a window. The whole time, the cop firing his gun was laughing and yelling about something about cops and robbers. Too stunned and horrified to know what to do about this, I kept driving. But the sights along the way to the hospital got stranger and stranger along the way. Mr. Scraps had been very busy. A full-grown man was seen on his hands and knees in his driveway, burning ants with a magnifying glass. An elderly woman was on the roof of her 2-story house, dancing and singing along to a record player she'd hooked up there. Two people who looked like they were in their 80s were drawing with sidewalk chalk on Main Street, blocking 2 lanes of traffic, and I had to honk to get them out of the way. People were walking out of a department store carrying bicycles, which they got onto and rode away one after another. I counted at least 20 of them and saw a man inside was handing them out to anyone who asked. Another employee could be seen behind him, setting stuffed animals on fire, and dancing around a bonfire he'd made with their furry, blazing bodies. I could see more chaos happening through the large front windows of the store, and had to tear my eyes away to look back at my driving. A moment later, I had to swerve to avoid a man in a plumber's uniform riding a skateboard. We were almost at the hospital, and I was becoming more and more afraid of what we might find there. I pulled up to the front door, not caring about getting a ticket as I left the car behind. I was feeling fairly certain that a parking ticket was the least of my worries now. Once we got inside the ER, I began to smell the dead bodies. "It stinks in here," my wife said, covering her nose with one hand, holding onto her doll with the other. "Can we go home?" "Not yet," I said, hating the way she was talking. I wanted to scream at her to speak like a normal adult, but I knew that wouldn't help anything. This wasn't her fault, it was Mr. Scraps. He had done something to her. Not just her, he had done something to the whole fucking town. The emergency department was empty, aside from the corpses. There were at least 3 dead bodies I could see right away. They were strapped to gurneys, and one had coagulated blood dripping from the stretcher down to the floor below. A man who appeared to have been in a car accident was white from blood loss, his face frozen in a scream. There was an elderly woman with a grin stuck on her face, similarly dead. I couldn't bear to look at that last one, and pulled my wife past, heading for the desk. There was no triage nurse or anyone to greet us. The small emergency department was devoid of any staff members, no doctors or nurses, orderlies or cleaners. I walked past the section with my wife, pulling her along like a child during a temper tantrum. She kept saying she wanted to go home, and I couldn't blame her. Eventually I found a doctor. At least I presumed she was a doctor. The 50-ish-year-old woman was wearing a white coat and had a stethoscope in her hands, but she was on the floor holding the listening end of the instrument up to the chest of a small stuffed bear. "You're very sick, Mr. Teddy," she said, pulling him in for a hug. "But I'm going to make you all better." My wife got down on the floor of the waiting room and sat down next to her. The two of them built up a silent rapport like kids usually do. They began to play together, and my wife held up her doll for the woman to use her instrument to check her out next. "Can I try next?" she asked politely. The doctor woman nodded enthusiastically, and they started introducing themselves to each other. I left them there for a few minutes to continue searching for a grown-up, someone who had not yet made the mistake of speaking to Mr. Scraps. As I turned a corner, there he was. It was as if he knew I was coming. He was looking through a bin of cans beside a door that said staff break room, but he looked up when he saw me. The two of us locked eyes for a second, then I ducked back behind the wall. I heard him rummaging through the cans again a moment later. I've been stuck here ever since. I haven't moved. I don't know why, but I feel like I need to speak with him. Something is pulling me around that corner to talk to him just like all the others. The sound of cans being shuffled is almost hypnotizing, and is almost making me forget why I was here in the first place. Maybe it's because I looked into his eyes. Twice now. Maybe that's all it takes for him to get his hooks in you. Maybe he really is a sorcerer. Something more than human. There's no way to stop it. I could barely get through typing this out, but I need there to be a record. I need proof. I'm terrified of what's going to happen to me, but I need to ask him. I need to ask him what he did to my wife, and if there's any way to reverse it. If something happens to me and you don't hear from me again, please just listen to my advice. Don't speak to Mr. Scraps. If he shows up in your town, let him make all the noise he wants. Let him take your cans and bottles. And be grateful that he doesn't take anything else.